Hi, Kevin Wright back with another property finance tip. And what's it about this week? Well, it's about rent to rent, or more precisely, how rent to rent doesn't work if you do three particular things. So if you want to find out what those three things are that you should never be doing with rent to rent, keep watching. Okay, so maybe you're thinking about starting out with rent to rent as the first stage on your property journey, or you could already be into rent to rent and doing it already. But there's three big mistakes that I see investors make when they're setting up their rent to rent deals. Now, it's probably just a lack of understanding on their part. And I've identified these mistakes because of my many years' experience as a property finance brokering everything from a simple buy-to-let mortgage right up to multi-million pound development loans. I'm going to explain to you what those three things are. But before I do that, if you've already done a rent-to-rent course and you haven't been told that, then the trainer is not being fully transparent with you on the realities of rent-to-rent. Maybe you've had the good bits of, here's how to make some money, here's how to replace your income, but not the bad bits, if you want to call them bad bits, and they're not really bad bits, they're just things you have to avoid doing. So what exactly are these three things? Well, before we get down into that, let me drill down and look at how you can do a rent-to-rent deal with a landlord. And it breaks down into one of two areas. You can either do a rent-to-rent deal with a landlord that has a mortgage or doesn't have a mortgage. Now, if they don't have a mortgage and they own the property outright or unencumbered, happy days. Pretty much, you can strike up any kind of deal that makes sense to you and the landlord. And as long as you're both happy, crack on right with it. But, and it is often a big but, when the landlord that you're trying to do your rent-to-rent deal, and it doesn't really matter whether you're going to do it on a serviced accommodation basis and have people in and out of there on a nightly basis or a weekly basis, or whether you want to give them ASTs, and rent out by the room. It doesn't really matter which of those it is. If the landlord's got a mortgage, you've potentially got a big problem unless you set it up right. And what is the problem? It's the terms and conditions that the landlord's mortgage lender imposes on how that landlord rents out that property. Now, in most cases, the landlord is going to have a standard buy-to-let mortgage. And standard buy-to-let mortgage lenders are pretty limited in what they allow you to do. In most cases, they only allow you to rent out on a single AST basis. Now, there are a few exceptions to that go up to 4 ASTs, but pretty much that's about it. The minute you start doing a rent-to-rent contract with a landlord who's got a mortgage, who's got a buy-to-let mortgage, you are in breach of at least one and usually more of their terms and conditions. So let's look at the three most common breaches that running rent to rent would actually flag up. Number one, the length of the rental agreement. Now, pretty much every buy-to-let lender imposes in their terms and conditions a minimum and maximum rental term. And in most cases, the minimum is 6 months. So you can only rent out the property, or the landlord can only rent out the property on a minimum 6-month term. And the maximum is usually 12 months. Now, there are a few buy-to-let lenders now that have gone beyond 12 months to longer terms, so they allow up to 3 years, but they're pretty much in a minority. So that's the first one. Now, if you've got a management contract and it's in excess of 12 months, which it might well be, it could be 3 years or even 5 years, it's probable that with the majority of buy-to-let lenders that you've breached the terms under which that lender allows the landlord to rent that property out. So your management contract is a breach. We're going to look at the consequences of these breaches once we've gone through all three of the breaches. Okay, so that was breach one. Breach two is that the contract between landlord and tenant must be an AST. An AST is the only permissible contract. Now, you can't have an AST as a rent-to-renter with your landlord because you're not going to live in it. So an AST, if you are doing an AST, that's wrong too. But if you're doing the correct management contract, because it's not an AST, there's breach too. So you've breached your landlord's mortgage lender's conditions by having a rental contract to rent the property out that is not an AST. Breach 3. Now, the terms and conditions of a standard buy-to-let mortgage say that the component parts or the people in a contract must be the landlord, which of course it is, and the tenant in situ. Now, you're not the tenant in situ. The people you're renting it out to, whether they're on ASTs between you and the tenant, or whether they're on short-term lets because you're doing Airbnb type letting or whatever. Whichever it is, it's not a landlord-tenant in situ rental agreement. So by doing your rent-to-rent agreement, you've encouraged or collaborated with your landlord in breaching at least 3 of his or her mortgage lender's terms and conditions. Now, you might say, well, what does that matter? As long as I don't get found out, as long as the landlord doesn't get found out, the lender doesn't know, and they'll just carry on. Anyway, they don't care as long as the mortgage is being paid. They'll turn a blind eye to any transgressions. Now, unfortunately, that is fundamentally not the case. Now, when mortgage lenders do uncover breaches to conditions, they invariably send a cease and desist letter, which is stop doing what you're doing, bring your renting arrangements back into line with the terms and conditions of the mortgage product you've got, or face further action. Now, what is further action? Well, in the worst case scenario, lenders have the default option of calling in the mortgage, which means giving you only a few short weeks to repay the mortgage. Well, not you, of course, because it's not your mortgage. Giving your landlord just a few short weeks to repay the mortgage. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means them hastily selling the property or hastily remortgaging the property, neither of which is going to leave you in a comfortable position, because given the choice of A, losing the property, or B, getting rid of you as a renter and dumping your contract and complying with their mortgage lender's terms and conditions, they're invariably going to dump you. So if you're going to run a rent-to-rent agreement with a landlord who's got a mortgage and you don't check all of these things out, then your rent-to-rent business is built on shifting sand, because the landlord is likely to pull the plug on you at any given moment, faced with the choice of losing you as a tenant, if you want to put it that way, or losing the property. If you're going to do this properly and you're going to still use landlords that have got mortgages, they have to have a mortgage that meets the use that they're putting it to. So if you're using this as a rent-to-rent serviced accommodation model, then the landlord's mortgage must allow short-term letting. And that has to be a specialist mortgage, and there's very few of those around. They are around, but there's very few of them around, and rates are higher. If you're doing it on a multiple AST basis, well, you might need an HMO license as well, but that's nothing to do with the mortgage lender. The mortgage lender would need to permit multiple ASTs, so you need to change the mortgage. Now, in either case, to be compliant and to keep within a mortgage lender's terms and conditions, your landlord would need to remortgage to a compatible and compliant mortgage. Now, that's going to cost money, and it's almost certainly going to be at a higher interest rate than they're paying now. So the question really is a landlord going to go all through that expense just so they can rent their property to you on a rent-to-rent basis? And in most cases, the answer would be, once they realise what's involved, they probably wouldn't. So what's the lesson here? Well, the lesson is not don't do rent-to-rent, because done properly, it can still be a viable strategy. Okay, it's more of a short-term strategy because you're using it to generate short-term income rather than long-term wealth. For long-term wealth, you pretty much have to own assets, not just control them. So the message here really is, if you're going to do rent-to-rent, you're on much safer ground if you focus on landlords that don't have mortgages. Now, clearly that's going to cut down your scope to do rent-to-rent deals, because there are fewer landlords that don't have mortgages. More landlords do have mortgages. But If it's a landlord with a mortgage, you're going to need to put it on the correct footing in terms of mortgages. You're going to have an upfront discussion with your landlord about their willingness to switch mortgage products to allow them to rent compliantly to you on a rent-to-rent basis. I see this question come up quite a lot, so I thought I'd address it this week and give you some straightforward pointers from the lender's point of view, not from the landlord's or from your point of view as a rent-to-renter. If you've enjoyed this video, I'll be back next week with another property finance tip. But hey, have you subscribed yet? If not, click the subscribe button below. And if that dingy belly thing pops up down there, click that too, and then you'll get a notification every time I release a video, which is normally twice a week now, on a Thursday evening and a Monday morning. So I'll be back next week with another property finance tip. See you then.
If you enjoyed watching this video, did you know every Monday morning at 8:30 I do a live Facebook Q&A. So if you want to start the week with checking out some answers to your property finance questions, click the link here.